What do you say to a general who demands all the glory while another man bleeds for the victory? In the sweltering summer of 1943, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Sicily in Operation Husky, two of the most ambitious commanders in military history found themselves locked in a rivalry that threatened to fracture the very alliance meant to defeat fascism. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, meticulously planned every move with mathematical precision, convinced that his methodical approach represented the only path to victory. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the hard-charging American cavalryman with ivory-handled pistols and a vocabulary that could make a sailor blush, burned with an insatiable hunger to prove that American arms could match or surpass British military achievement. On July 10, 1943, when the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in military history commenced along Sicily's southeastern shores, these two titans commanded forces that would determine not just the fate of an island, but the future balance of power within the Anglo-American alliance itself. Montgomery landed at the southeastern tip near Syracuse with his 8th Army, a force tempered by years of desert warfare and absolute confidence in their commander's invincibility. Patton's 7th Army came ashore to the west, at Gela and Licata, where they immediately faced ferocious German counterattacks from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division that nearly pushed them back into the Mediterranean. While Montgomery's forces advanced methodically up the eastern coast toward Messina, the ultimate prize that would secure control of the island and open the gateway to mainland Italy, Patton found himself relegated to what Montgomery considered a supporting role, protecting the British left flank while the 8th Army claimed the glory. The American general, whose ego was as outsized as his tactical brilliance, seethed with resentment at being treated as a subordinate player in what he viewed as an American operation. Within days, the strategic dynamic that would define the Sicilian campaign and expose the fault lines in Allied command structure became painfully apparent to everyone except perhaps Montgomery himself. The British Field Marshal, operating under the operational plan he had largely dictated to General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, expected his advance to Messina would proceed with the same inexorable success that had characterized his pursuit of Rommel across North Africa. But Sicily was not the western desert, and the German commander Albert Kesselring had no intention of simply retreating before Montgomery's advance. The terrain itself seemed designed to frustrate the methodical British approach, with Mount Etna dominating the eastern approaches to Messina, creating natural defensive positions that German and Italian forces exploited with devastating effectiveness. Montgomery's advance, which began with such promise, soon bogged down in the face of determined German resistance, narrow mountain roads, expertly placed demolitions, and the limitations of an operational concept that prioritized caution over audacity. If you're captivated by the untold tensions that shaped World War II's most critical campaigns, subscribe to this channel right now because we're exposing the leadership conflicts that history books often sanitize. Hit that like button to help this story reach others who need to understand how Allied victory was nearly derailed by ego and ambition. Share this video with anyone fascinated by Churchill, Patton, or Montgomery, and leave a comment telling us which commander you think demonstrated the better leadership during the Sicily campaign, because the answer might surprise you when you hear what happened next. General Harold Alexander, the overall ground commander for Operation Husky and a British officer known for his diplomatic skills and aristocratic demeanor, found himself in an impossible position as the campaign evolved. Alexander had tremendous respect for Montgomery, his subordinate who had delivered Britain's first major land victory against Germany at El Alamein in October 1942, and he was naturally inclined to defer to the Field Marshal's judgment on operational matters. Yet he also recognized that Patton, for all his bombastic personality and theatrical posturing, possessed an operational audacity that Montgomery lacked, a willingness to take calculated risks that could potentially break open a stalemate. On July 17, just 1 week into the campaign, Patton visited Alexander's headquarters with a proposal that would fundamentally alter the operation's trajectory. With Montgomery stalled before the formidable German defensive positions anchored on Mount Etna, Patton requested permission to drive north and west toward Palermo, the Sicilian capital on the island's northwestern coast. Montgomery's staff officers dismissed this as a wasteful diversion, arguing that Palermo held no strategic significance and that Patton's proper role remained protecting the 8th Army's flank. But Patton understood something that eluded Montgomery's more conventional military mind. Warfare is as much psychological as physical, and capturing a major city would demonstrate American military capability while potentially unhinging the entire German defensive scheme. Alexander, perhaps sensing an opportunity to accelerate the campaign's conclusion and eager to avoid the appearance of American subservience to British strategic direction, granted Patton's request. What happened next would become the stuff of military legend and would permanently alter the dynamic between Allied commanders. Patton unleashed his Seventh Army in a whirlwind advance across Sicily's western half, a campaign of movement that recalled his beloved cavalry heritage rather than the grinding attrition of modern mechanized warfare. His Provisional Corps under Major General Geoffrey Keyes covered rugged mountain terrain with astonishing speed, accepting risks that would have horrified Montgomery's more cautious staff. On July 22, just 5 days after receiving permission to advance, Patton's forces entered Palermo in triumph, capturing tens of thousands of Italian prisoners and seizing Sicily's largest city while Montgomery remained deadlocked before Catania. The symbolic impact was enormous and immediate, splashed across American newspapers that had grown weary of reading about British victories while American forces played supporting roles. Patton's achievement in reaching Palermo in such spectacular fashion created a public relations nightmare for the British military establishment and a strategic complication for the Allied command structure. The American press, which had treated the invasion of Sicily as primarily a British operation in its initial coverage, now discovered a swashbuckling American hero who embodied the aggressive spirit that the American public expected from their military commanders. Newspapers from New York to Los Angeles ran front-page stories celebrating Patton's lightning advance, often with implicit or explicit comparisons to Montgomery's stalled progress on the eastern coast. The political implications extended far beyond simple military reportage, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of the Anglo-American alliance and whether American forces would continue to accept strategic direction from British commanders who seemed more concerned with preserving British prestige than achieving Allied objectives. British newspapers, defensive about any suggestion that Montgomery had been outperformed, emphasized that Palermo was strategically irrelevant, a sideshow that contributed nothing to the campaign's actual objective of capturing Messina and securing Sicily. Montgomery himself appeared remarkably unconcerned with Patton's western adventure, convinced that history would record his Eighth Army's capture of Messina as the campaign's decisive achievement. But this conviction rested on an assumption that was rapidly becoming untenable, that his forces would, in fact, capture Messina while Patton remained occupied in the west. Instead, something unexpected happened that would test Montgomery's composure and Churchill's diplomatic skills. After securing Palermo, Patton immediately pivoted his forces eastward toward Messina, no longer content with operations that Montgomery's staff dismissed as irrelevant to the main effort. He launched a two-pronged advance along Sicily's northern coast and through the island's interior, employing the same aggressive tactics that had brought him to Palermo with such speed. The American advance encountered the same difficult terrain and determined German resistance that had stymied Montgomery, but Patton drove his commanders relentlessly, accepting casualties that Montgomery would have considered unacceptable in pursuit of speed and momentum. He even ordered amphibious end runs along the coastal road, using small landing craft to leapfrog American forces behind German defensive positions in operations that combined tactical innovation with operational audacity. Montgomery's staff suddenly realized that the campaign they had assumed would conclude with British forces triumphantly entering Messina might instead end with Americans claiming that prize. The implications for British military prestige and future Allied command arrangements were potentially catastrophic from the British perspective. Montgomery responded to this unexpected development with characteristic stubbornness, ordering his Eighth Army to accelerate their advance despite the formidable obstacles. His forces launched renewed attacks against German positions that had proven impervious to previous assaults, suffering casualties in fighting that military historians would later describe as some of the most difficult of the Italian campaign. The British and Canadian troops under Montgomery's command fought with tremendous courage and skill, but they were attempting to batter through the strongest German defensive positions on the island, while Patton's forces exploited the relatively weaker western approaches. By early August, it became apparent to informed observers that the race for Messina had become exactly that, a race between two Allied armies whose commanders were more focused on defeating each other than on efficiently defeating the Germans. General Eisenhower, watching the spectacle from his headquarters in Algiers, found himself in an extraordinarily delicate position that would define his role as Supreme Allied Commander for the remainder of the war. Eisenhower understood that maintaining Allied unity required managing the competing egos and national ambitions of subordinate commanders who viewed each other as rivals rather than partners. He privately expressed frustration with both Montgomery and Patton, recognizing that their competition was diverting energy from the campaign's strategic objectives, yet he also recognized that he lacked the political capital to simply order them to cooperate more effectively. The American general was acutely aware that his position as Supreme Commander rested on a delicate political balance between American material superiority and British military experience, and any action that appeared to favor one national contingent over another risked undermining his authority. Churchill faced an even more complex challenge in London, where he had to balance his genuine admiration for Montgomery's military achievements against the political reality that Britain's continued influence in Allied strategy depended on maintaining American confidence in British military leadership. The Prime Minister had invested enormous political capital in promoting Montgomery as Britain's foremost military commander, the general who had reversed Britain's fortunes in North Africa and restored British military prestige after years of defeat and humiliation. But Churchill was also a shrewd political operator who understood that the balance of power within the alliance was shifting inexorably toward the Americans as their military contribution expanded and British resources became increasingly strained. The situation reached its critical point in mid-August as both Allied armies converged on Messina and Montgomery began making statements that would test even Churchill's legendary diplomatic skills. Montgomery, apparently convinced that his methodical approach deserved primary credit for the Sicily campaign's success despite the increasingly obvious evidence that Patton had reached Messina first, began framing the operation's conclusion in ways that minimized American contributions. He spoke to British journalists about how the Eighth Army's operations had been the campaign's decisive element, creating the conditions that allowed Patton's forces to advance in the West. His public statements and private communications suggested that he viewed Patton's capture of Palermo as a militarily meaningless publicity stunt and that the difficult fighting on the eastern approaches to Messina represented the campaign's true strategic center of gravity. These characterizations, while containing elements of military logic, completely ignored the fact that Patton's forces had covered far greater distances, captured more prisoners, and were likely to enter Messina before Montgomery's own troops. The British Field Marshal's tendency to claim credit for Allied successes while minimizing others' contributions had been tolerated when British forces constituted the majority of Allied strength, but it was becoming increasingly problematic as American military power grew. Churchill received reports of Montgomery's pronouncements with growing alarm, recognizing that the Field Marshal's self-promotion was creating a political crisis that threatened Anglo-American cooperation at the strategic level. The Prime Minister understood, perhaps better than any of his military commanders, that Britain's ability to influence Allied strategy depended on American willingness to accept British strategic direction, and that willingness was rapidly eroding in the face of perceived British arrogance and credit-claiming. Churchill had already weathered American suspicions that British strategy in the Mediterranean was designed more to preserve the British Empire than to defeat Germany, and he could not afford to have those suspicions reinforced by Montgomery's apparent inability to acknowledge American military achievements. On August 17, 1943, American forces entered Messina first, beating Montgomery's Eighth Army by hours in a conclusion that seemed almost deliberately calculated to humiliate the British commander who had assumed the prize would be his. We've reached the midpoint of this extraordinary story, and the drama is about to intensify as Churchill confronts Montgomery's behavior. Subscribe if you haven't already, because understanding these leadership dynamics is essential to comprehending how the Allied coalition functioned under pressure. Like this video to ensure others discover these hidden tensions that shaped the war's outcome, and share it with history enthusiasts who appreciate complexity over simplified narratives. Comment below with the most surprising detail you've learned so far about the Sicily campaign, because your engagement helps us continue producing historically rigorous content that challenges conventional wisdom. Montgomery's reaction to being beaten into Messina revealed much about his character and the challenges Churchill faced in managing his most successful field commander. Rather than acknowledging Patton's achievement or congratulating American forces on their rapid advance, Montgomery immediately began crafting a narrative that downplayed the significance of who entered Messina first. He argued, with some justification, that the Germans had executed a brilliant withdrawal, evacuating the bulk of their forces across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy before Allied forces could trap them, and that therefore the race to Messina had been strategically meaningless since the real objective of destroying German forces had not been achieved. This analysis contained undeniable truth, as Kesselring had indeed extracted approximately 40,000 German troops plus substantial Italian forces and equipment despite Allied air and naval superiority. But Montgomery's framing conveniently ignored his own role in the German escape, particularly his failure to break through German defensive positions quickly enough to threaten their withdrawal routes. It also failed to acknowledge that if the race to Messina had been militarily meaningless, his own insistence on capturing the city and his forces' costly assaults to accelerate their advance had been equally meaningless. The inconsistency was apparent to American commanders who increasingly viewed Montgomery as unwilling to credit American achievements regardless of the evidence. Patton, characteristically immodest in victory, made certain that American newspapers understood his Seventh Army's accomplishment, providing journalists with detailed accounts of the distances covered, obstacles overcome, and the symbolic significance of American forces leading the way into Messina. The contrast between Patton's triumphant publicity and Montgomery's defensive explanations created exactly the kind of Allied disunity that concerned Churchill most deeply. Churchill's private communications from this period reveal a man deeply troubled by Montgomery's behavior and its implications for Anglo-American relations. In conversations with his chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Alan Brooke, Churchill expressed frustration that Montgomery seemed constitutionally incapable of the diplomatic flexibility that coalition warfare required. Brooke, who was Montgomery's patron and strongest defender within the British military establishment, tried to shield the Field Marshal from Churchill's irritation, arguing that Montgomery's tactical brilliance and proven record of success justified tolerance of his difficult personality. But even Brooke recognized that Montgomery's latest bout of credit claiming had crossed a line, potentially damaging British interests in ways that tactical success could not repair. Churchill faced the delicate task of correcting Montgomery's behavior without publicly undermining the commander in whom he had invested so much political capital and upon whom Britain's military reputation substantially depended. The Prime Minister's solution demonstrated his characteristic combination of political cunning and psychological insight. Rather than confronting Montgomery directly with criticism, which would likely have provoked defensive rigidity from a commander notably resistant to acknowledging mistakes, Churchill chose to praise Patton and American military achievements in ways that implicitly rebuked Montgomery without explicitly criticizing him. In public statements and communications with Roosevelt, Churchill emphasized the Sicily campaign as a triumph of Allied cooperation, specifically highlighting American contributions and Patton's bold leadership. He made certain that his praise for American achievements received wide publicity, effectively countering Montgomery's narrative without engaging in direct confrontation with his own commander. In more private settings, Churchill was considerably more pointed, reportedly remarking to intimates that Montgomery's inability to share credit gracefully was becoming a strategic liability that Britain could ill afford. The Prime Minister understood that the fundamental challenge was not Montgomery's ego per se, but rather the changing strategic reality that Britain's declining relative power within the alliance required British commanders to demonstrate diplomatic skills that Montgomery conspicuously lacked. Churchill's most significant intervention came in his direct communications with Montgomery following the campaign's conclusion, messages that combined diplomatic language with unmistakable warnings about future behavior. The Prime Minister congratulated Montgomery on the Eighth Army's achievements in Sicily, acknowledging the difficult fighting and the professionalism of British and Commonwealth forces. But Churchill also made clear that the Sicily campaign had demonstrated the growing capability of American forces under aggressive leadership, and that future Allied operations would increasingly reflect American strategic preferences and priorities. He emphasized, in language carefully calibrated to penetrate Montgomery's self-assurance, that Britain's continued influence in Allied strategy required British commanders to acknowledge and celebrate Allied achievements rather than competing for individual glory. Churchill pointed out that Patton, for all his flaws and theatrical personality, had demonstrated qualities of operational audacity that Allied strategy would increasingly require as the war entered its climactic phase. The Prime Minister's message contained an implicit warning: Montgomery's approach, which prioritized certainty over speed and minimized casualties even at the cost of operational tempo, represented a style of warfare that Britain's limited manpower could afford, but that did not align with American expectations for how the war should be prosecuted. Churchill understood, even if Montgomery did not, that the Americans would not indefinitely accept British strategic direction if British commanders appeared more concerned with preserving British forces than with aggressively defeating the enemy. The Field Marshal's response to Churchill's diplomatic intervention revealed the limits of the Prime Minister's influence over his military commanders. Montgomery acknowledged Churchill's points with formal politeness but showed little evidence of genuinely internalizing the criticism or modifying his behavior. In his memoirs and subsequent statements, Montgomery continued to frame the Sicily campaign as primarily a British achievement, describing his Eighth Army's operations as the decisive element while treating Patton's advance as a peripheral contribution. This persistent pattern of self-promotion and credit-claiming would continue throughout the remainder of the war, creating ongoing tensions with American commanders and contributing to Eisenhower's eventual decision to limit Montgomery's role in the final campaigns. The Sicily campaign and its aftermath marked a turning point in Anglo-American military relations that extended far beyond the immediate question of who deserved credit for capturing Messina. American military leaders, led by General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, drew clear conclusions from Montgomery's behavior and Churchill's inability to completely control it. They recognized that British commanders, however professionally competent, operated within a framework of imperial interests and national prestige that did not always align with American strategic objectives. The Americans increasingly insisted on command arrangements that gave American generals authority commensurate with American contributions to Allied operations, a principle that would lead to Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Normandy despite British preferences for a British commander or at minimum for Montgomery to command all ground forces. The Sicily campaign demonstrated that American forces under aggressive leadership could match or exceed British military achievements, undercutting British arguments that their greater experience justified continued strategic primacy. Patton's performance, whatever his personal flaws and the disciplinary incidents that would soon threaten his career, proved that American generals could execute complex operations with speed and effectiveness that challenged Montgomery's methodical approach. Churchill understood these implications even if Montgomery did not, and the Prime Minister's frustration with his field marshal reflected his awareness that British military influence was declining in proportion to Montgomery's inability to function effectively as a coalition commander. The strategic consequences extended to the planning for subsequent operations in Italy and eventually for the cross-channel invasion of France. American insistence on a more aggressive operational approach, particularly the direct assault on France rather than continued Mediterranean operations, gained credibility from Patton's demonstration that bold action could achieve results that Montgomery's caution could not. British strategic preferences for peripheral operations that would weaken Germany before attempting a direct assault increasingly appeared to American planners as rationalizations for avoiding decisive action, a perception that Montgomery's performance in Sicily reinforced rather than challenged. The personal relationship between Churchill and Montgomery, while remaining formally cordial, never fully recovered from the tensions exposed during and after the Sicily campaign. Churchill continued to recognize Montgomery's military competence and to defend him against critics within the British government and military establishment who found the field marshal's personality insufferable. But the Prime Minister also became increasingly skeptical of Montgomery's strategic judgment, and particularly his tendency to overestimate his own achievements while underestimating operational challenges. This skepticism would manifest in Churchill's strong support for alternative commanders like General Harold Alexander and Field Marshal Bernard Slim when opportunities arose for key commands. The Prime Minister's private correspondence reveals a man who admired Montgomery's tactical skills but despaired of his diplomatic limitations and worried that the Field Marshal's ego would undermine British strategic interests at critical moments. Churchill's handling of the post-Sicily credit dispute demonstrated his recognition that maintaining Allied unity required British leaders to acknowledge American contributions generously rather than grudgingly, even when British forces had borne the brunt of fighting or suffered heavier casualties. This principle reflected Churchill's broader understanding that Britain's ability to shape the post-war world depended on maintaining American engagement and goodwill, which required accommodating American sensitivities even when British commanders found them unjustified. Montgomery's apparent inability to grasp this fundamental political reality frustrated Churchill because it complicated the Prime Minister's larger strategic objectives. The Field Marshal seemed to believe that military competence alone would determine his role and Britain's influence, failing to understand that coalition warfare operated according to political logic that transcended purely military considerations. Churchill's attempts to educate Montgomery on these political realities met with limited success, as the Field Marshal remained convinced that his methodical approach represented the only professional standard and that Patton's more flamboyant style reflected American inexperience rather than a legitimate alternative operational philosophy. The broader historical significance of the Churchill-Montgomery tension during the Sicily campaign lies in what it reveals about the challenges of coalition warfare and the transition of strategic leadership from Britain to the United States during World War II. Britain entered the war as the senior partner in the Anglo-American alliance, with greater military experience, established strategic concepts, and commanders who had already fought against German forces while America was still at peace. By mid-1943, when Allied forces invaded Sicily, the balance was shifting rapidly as American military production overwhelmed British capacity and American forces deployed in numbers that dwarfed British contributions. This transition created inevitable tensions as British commanders who had grown accustomed to strategic leadership found themselves increasingly subordinate to American decisions and American commanders who lacked their experience but possessed resources that Britain could not match. Montgomery personified the British military establishment's difficulty in adjusting to this new reality, insisting on prerogatives and deference that Britain's declining relative power no longer supported. Churchill, with his acute political instincts and his lifelong study of Britain's strategic position, understood that Britain's influence depended on gracefully accepting American leadership while shaping American strategy through persuasion rather than assertion. The Prime Minister's frustration with Montgomery reflected his recognition that commanders who insisted on British primacy regardless of the strategic balance were undermining rather than advancing British interests. The Sicily campaign became a test case for whether British commanders could function effectively in coalition structures where Americans increasingly called the shots, and Montgomery's performance suggested troubling answers. Patton's triumph in reaching Palermo and then Messina first was not merely a tactical achievement, but a symbolic demonstration that American forces no longer needed British tutelage and that American commanders could execute operations with a boldness that Montgomery's caution precluded. Churchill's response to Montgomery's credit claiming was therefore not simply about managing a difficult personality, but about preserving Britain's strategic influence by demonstrating that British leaders understood and accepted the changing dynamics of the alliance. As we reach the end of this complex story about ambition, alliance, and the price of victory, take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the historical insights that textbooks overlook. Like this video if you appreciate deep dives into the human conflicts that shaped world events, and share it with someone who needs to understand that military history is ultimately about people, egos, and the difficult choices leaders face under pressure. Leave a comment telling us what aspect of the Churchill-Montgomery-Patton dynamic you found most revealing, because these conversations help us understand not just the past but the timeless challenges of leadership and coalition building that remain relevant today. Churchill's handling of Montgomery after Sicily established patterns that would repeat throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war period, as the Prime Minister balanced his need for competent commanders against the political requirements of alliance management. Montgomery continued to achieve military successes, particularly during the Normandy campaign where his operations around Caen tied down German armored reserves while American forces broke out at St. Lo, but he also continued to claim credit in ways that infuriated American commanders and complicated Eisenhower's task as supreme commander. Churchill's interventions became more forceful over time, particularly during the controversial period after the Battle of the Bulge when Montgomery suggested that his forces had rescued the Americans from disaster and implied that British leadership should assume greater authority over Allied operations. The Prime Minister recognized that Montgomery's latest bout of self-promotion threatened to fracture the alliance at a critical moment and forced the Field Marshal to issue a public statement acknowledging American achievements and Eisenhower's leadership. These recurring tensions illustrated fundamental truths about coalition warfare that remain relevant in contemporary military operations. That successful alliances require commanders who can subordinate personal and national ambitions to collective objectives, that strategic influence depends on political as much as military factors, and that leaders like Churchill who understand these dynamics must constantly mediate between military effectiveness and political sustainability. The story of what Churchill said and did when Montgomery claimed credit while Patton raced to Palermo and Messina is ultimately a story about how great leaders navigate the competing demands of national interest, alliance cohesion, personal loyalty, and strategic effectiveness. Churchill's solution, praising American achievements while gently correcting British overreach, demonstrated diplomatic skills that were as essential to Allied victory as tactical brilliance or operational planning. The Sicily campaign foreshadowed the challenges that would dominate Allied operations for the remainder of the war and established the command relationships and national dynamics that would shape the post-war world, making it far more than just a stepping stone to the invasion of Italy, but rather a crucial moment when the Anglo-American alliance defined its character and Britain accepted its transition from senior to junior partner in the coalition that would defeat Nazi Germany and shape the remainder of the 20th century.